So I am in a predicament because I'm, on the one hand, very, very, very happy indeed to welcome Alexander Somek to give a keynote lecture, and at the same time, I'm not really sure how to introduce him properly. And that has several reasons. One is that in 2003, Fleur Johns, who had just graduated from the doctoral program at Harvard, was also asked to give a keynote speech, and she said, "Why would anybody ask me, and why are people singled out to give keynote speeches? It's a very odd thing." But the lecture that she then gave was really fantastic. It's called On Writing Dangerously. So there is sort of a kinship between Somek and Johns, because they're both writing dangerously. And so sort of the choice to ask in such a group of scholars that has come to London now, to ask one of those scholars, can you give a lecture where you have 10 minutes more and we'll call it keynote lecture? You know, that's it's sort of unfair, but in this case, I hope you find it justified. And also you should know that he resisted, which is, you know, a good sign. So, one of the reasons why it will be such a pleasure to hear Alexander Somek give this lecture is because of the way he interprets things that we somehow feel and know and are aware of, that they surround us, but he gives them a particular twist in engaging with them, and that you can discern from anything he writes. And he writes a lot, and it's very accessible. And I can only recommend that you look at some of his work. Most recently, but that's probably not true anymore, is a book, this book, The Cosmopolitan Constitution, which if you think, well, Alexander Somek, he's probably a public lawyer, a constitutional lawyer, he's a legal theorist, he spent a long time in Iowa, of all places, but where he transformed a group of students to help him edit a very powerful transnational law journal. And then he returned to Vienna a couple of years ago, and he writes this book, and you think, well, it's just another book on what Europe is and where Europe is going. But the analysis of what Europe might be all about and the transformation that Europe has been undergoing is really fascinating. And it's written in a style that is so captivating and at the same time so elegant that anybody who wants to introduce such a lecture, you know, would just have to compete in terms of finesse and elegance of language, and I'm not going to try that. So without further ado, thank you very much for coming and for your speech.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Per. Thank you for the kind introductory words. Yes, I was indeed reluctant to accept the invitation to participate in a conference on sovereignty, because until recently I wasn't terribly interested in the topic, but this changed after I received this invitation. And I sense that I received this invitation for one particular reason. Pierre must have looked into my book on the Cosmopolitan Constitution and realized there's not a word on sovereignty in this book. How can this be? Go back to the desk and complete the work and make an amendment. So here I am with an attempt to make an amendment on constitutionalism. And of course, he engaged my amour propre, this terrible form of self-love that makes us do many stupid things out of our stupid ambition to shine in the eyes of others. Beautifully analyzed by Rousseau, by the way. Yeah? He engaged my self-love when he said, why don't you give a keynote lecture? So here I am, right before my keynote lecture. I'm old and I'm lazy, and this explains why I will, for the most part of my lecture, read from my manuscript. Also, in order to make sure that I do not make excessive use of my time here. And I encourage you to intercept me at any point. My long experience in academic life has reconfirmed what my first academic teacher, Rudolf Hocke, once told me, namely that the audience never notices when you stop right in the middle of your lecture before you get to your conclusion. All right. When authority becomes transnationally shared, things are no longer looking up for state sovereignty. Increasingly, the realities of governance give the lie to what has been presupposed by long-cherished normative beliefs concerning the position of states. Let me just repeat this here. First, it would be empirically ludicrous to take the legal status of states at face value the status that actually ascribes to them the power to rule supreme over a territory. Much of their power has by now been de facto crowded out by private actors, not least in the areas of regulation and dispute settlement. Transnational corporations hold sway over national policies by threatening governments and constituencies with their exit. The locus of real power has shifted from the state to those calling the shots in the international economy, such as investors, companies, and rating agencies. There's also increasing preponderance of international cooperation. Sustaining in the face of these developments the belief that the sovereign legal status of states translates into real power would amount to clinching to a rather silly abstraction. Second, even if sovereign territorial space were not already permitted by private power and sublated into the sphere of international cooperation, adhering to the normative status would be practically unwise too. States acting by themselves cannot accomplish much. They lack the capacity to address challenges of a transnational kind. Attempts to do so and to go it alone indicate myopia. The European refugee crisis has quite strongly reminded us of this fact. It shouldn't come as a surprise that liberal constitutional theory tends to endorse, quite unapologetically, the de facto demise of sovereign authority. Its basic instinct, as it were, inclines it to do so. Sovereign power is by design poised to interfere with natural liberty. Less of this power is, at least prima facie, better for human freedom. Or this is, at any rate, what liberalism suggests. Moreover, sovereignty remains problematic even when it is wearing the vestiges of democracy. Owing to policy externalities, democratic states can behave undemocratically by creating adverse effects for outsiders who are, by definition, excluded from political participation. States can earn democratic credentials only by opening themselves up to input from beyond their border. This is what a sibling of liberalism, namely the all-affected interests principle, suggests. Liberal discourse concludes, therefore, that sovereignty is not only factually hopeless and impossible, it would not be even desirable if it were possible. The legal status is in and of itself considered to be troubling. Disturbingly, this conclusion appears to be reconfirmed, in particular for the case in which sovereignty is supposed to be vested in a people. In fact, popular sovereignty must strike liberal theory as doubly faulty, for it combines the belief in sovereign state power, monopoly of force, with the belief in the existence of the mystical body of a people. In practice, these troubling beliefs feed into the politics of either imperialistic states or, worse still, or even worse, populist parties. In both cases, the results are highly likely to be morally repugnant. The observations that follow attempt to engage critically with the debunking of popular sovereignty. They begin with a reminder of the constitutional discourse that originally provided modern popular sovereignty with an intellectual home. It's the discourse that I call constitutionalism 1.0. In this context, popular sovereignty was believed to be manifest in action, namely in acts of founding and resistance. Once constitutional theory departs from this tradition, it severs sovereignty also from the world of action. Sovereignty is then believed to exhaust itself in the ethereal networks of public debates or in the fleeting peoplehood envisaged by the all-affected interests principle. In contrast to these developments, I would like to remind us of the fact that the people exercise power by virtue of being many. I think it's accurate to characterize the power of the many as sovereignty owing to how this power asserts itself. But the power of the many explains only in part the appeal of popular sovereignty. The other part is bootstrapping. A people is capable of addressing and overcoming the adversity that results from horizontal interdependence. A group of people can rise above and reach beyond themselves by acting as a people. I will get back to this point towards the end of my lecture, and I begin with a brief sketch of the original intellectual habitat of popular sovereignty in modern constitutionalist discourse. We owe it, or I actually owe it, to Bernard Jack, the quite perceptive observation that modern constitutionalist popular sovereignty, which we associate with the constituent power of the people, needs to be distinguished from prior invocations of this notion. While in the past the people were believed to be coextensive with the group whose members did not occupy a distinguished or noble rank, the people as the commoners or the demos, modern popular sovereignty actually introduces something like the idea of the people's two bodies. In contrast to the actual people, the people as the authors of a constitution comprise, and that's a technical term from canon law, a corpus mysticum. In this particular form, it is never to be encountered directly in whoever claims to act on its behalf. In a manner reminiscent of Kant's think in itself, it is a noumenal entity, inaccessible to actual experience. Paraphrasing Böckenförde, not only the constituent power, the people themselves are a Grenzbegriff, a limiting concept of constitutional law. Unsurprisingly, therefore, the significance of popular sovereignty has to be intrinsically tied to representation. The people as a people can only be present if they are represented. But representing always means that something is made present that is also and at the same time absent. Representing means making present what is absent. Evidently, any interpretive elaboration of the representation of a sovereign people can highlight either the presence of the people within a constitutional context or their absence. I begin with the presence. Highlighting the presence of a represented corporate body in the representative is characteristic of that strand of representation doctrine that goes as far back as to the work of Marsilius from Padua. The core idea is captured in Marsilius' concept of representatio identitatis. Forgive me that I pronounce Latin with a German accent. I don't know the English accent for Latin. Yeah? Representation is affected if it is representatio identitatis, not by delegation or mandate, but rather by virtue of the identity of the representative. It matters who one is. According to Marsilius' original doctrine, the pars valentia, the better sort, is representative of the group. Representatives are those part of a larger whole that best and most adequately express what this whole truly is. This was the major point of those claiming that the Council of Bishops had superior claim vis-à-vis the Pope to represent the corpus mysticum of the Church. A corporate body, the Council of the Bishops, is truer to what a church as a corporate body is. Identity representation highlights that the noumenon, the corpus mysticum, which could never reveal itself of itself, is present in the representative. In the constitutionalist context, British and French constitutionalism clearly must have believed for a long period of time that the will of the legislative body is inviolable and supreme, not least because the legislative body, rhetorically speaking, is the synecdoche of the unfathomable people. It represents better who the people are than the caput, the head of the state, the monarch. A completely different picture emerges, by contrast, when the emphasis comes to rest on the absence of the representative. No representative can then claim to mediate the presence of the people, or to enact rightfully the noumenon in the world of appearances. In this vein, the German constitutional theorist Martin Kriele concluded that within the constitutional democracy there can be no sovereign. One encounters only divided powers, and none of these can rightfully claim to be more a truthful representative than the others, not even the legislature. The popular sovereign remains just as inaccessible as transcendental freedom is inaccessible to human experience. Evidently, therefore, when we enter the conceptual field of popular sovereignty, we are confronted with a twin danger. On the one hand, identifying the people with one of his representatives, as identity representation suggests, is the recipe for undercutting any well-thought-out balance of powers. It designates the path towards undoing what the constituent power supposedly constitutes. For if the sovereign is present within the constitutional order, it cannot be subject to its constraints. Sovereign can do anything. If, on the other hand, epiphanies of sovereign power, of the sovereign power of the people, are categorically excluded from the universe of constitutional democracy, this power goes out of the window completely. Interestingly, this predicament explains why the nation, we haven't talked about the nation yet, why the nation has played such an important role in modern constitutional philosophy. Again, Jack's masterful analysis helps to elucidate this point. According to Jack, the people of modern power and sovereignty are a fusion of two forms of imagined community. The people proper on the one hand, and the nation on the other. The people is a mode, the people proper, the people that exercise sovereignty, is a mode of imagining community across space. A people exists in the form of the co-presence of a set of folks, more precisely the permanent residents, that are subject to the authority of the state. That's a people narrowly understood. They share exposure to state power, permanent exposure to state power. A nation, by contrast, provides us with an image of community that spans over time and connects the living with a mutually assured shared heritage. Now, the appeal to the nation, this is Jack's wonderful observation, the appeal to the nation is apt to fill in a blank that is left in the modern idea of popular sovereignty. Why? A sovereign people is supposed to precede, logically and temporally, the political authority of the state, for it is the people that constitute it. If the people are prior to the state cannot be the source of its unity. The people cannot be constituted through their short exposure to state power. Something else, therefore, has to account for the pre-political identity of the people, and this is the nation. The nation is the source of the people, and the people are the source of political authority. It is not by accident, hence, that popular sovereignty and nationhood appear in tandem in the context of constitutionalism 1.0, and they have since the 16th century largely been held, not been held distinct in our political language. Indeed, national identity permits us to navigate these above-mentioned two cliffs of popular sovereignty, that you destroy the political order if you admit to people, or that sovereignty becomes completely insignificant if you exclude them. The nation is not an organ of the Constitution. The will of the nation can ideally be articulated through the channels of constituted powers, but it is thereby not rendered completely absent. When appeals to the traditions or even the world historical mission of the people, think of the United States, become internalized into the ordinary life of a political community, the absent presence of the people can be integrated into a constitutional system in a manner that is not overly disruptive, but also not without significance. Yet, it requires that the sovereign populace conceive of it as a nation. We are not in the United States. We appear to be in a post-national situation. Let me take this as the premise for my further discussion. Being in a post-national situation is of no minor significance. When, as a result of learning from bitter experience, talking like a German, and as an Austrian I can share this bitter experience, the national noumenon drops out of the picture, what then happens is tantamount to the second death of God in political theology. While the first death of God merely led to the people claiming the place of the nomos basileus, to quote Carl Schmitt, himself quoting Pindar, now the whole conceptual fabric of modern political thought begins to unravel. And you know what? The idea of transnational democracy is just a mild expression for this great unraveling that we constantly experience. In what follows, I would like to highlight merely two developments that are the consequence of this great unraveling. The rise of ethereal popular sovereignty on the one hand, and the all-affected interests principle on the other. One encounters the first development prominently in Jürgen Habermas' reconceptualization of popular sovereignty qua procedure. According to Habermas, popular sovereignty resides in the free-floating public debates that do not avail of a center, such as a parliamentary assembly. Its intersubjective nature would be denied if we were to pull it together into a collective subject. With the dissolution of the collective subjectivity into the intersubjectivity of communication, popular sovereignty can reveal itself no longer in agency, but in the rational quality of public debates. It is in this manner that theorists of democracy manage to contain their fear of being disappointed by the people. Unenlightened outbursts of popular sentiments, xenophobia, racism, sexism, the classical expressions of the real existing and quite ungenteel proletariat. They can all be disposed of as undemocratic, as unexpressive of the spirit of a people with mature reason. Ethereal sovereignty accepts only a people with mature reason. The true rule by the people bears, therefore, the imprint of the serious engagement with arguments, the amenability to new topics and ideas, equal access to all affected, or the readiness to revise positions in light of better arguments. This is the core of ethereal popular sovereignty. Kant's people with mature reason admitted to constitutional discourse. And indeed, it seems to lay the foundation for reconceiving popular rule in a transnational context. As is well known, the work by John Dreiser and Simon Niemeyer has taken a particularly fascinating direction, since in their view, the opinions, views, and attitudes of the people mustn't matter unless they've gone through a process of deliberative purification. They have no qualms about delinking democracy from elections. Deliberation replaces the vote as the touchstone of democratic legitimacy. The true seat of democratic authority, or sovereignty for that matter, is public deliberation. Dreiser and Niemeyer therefore adopt, as a consequence of this, for the representation of discourses in a transnational context. This move is indeed radical, not least because it goes to the heart of the ontology of modern democracy. But it is, in a sense, the next logical step to take once the decomposition of the collective entity of the people is taken for granted. It just has to be extended to those whose heads used to be counted in order to determine the popular will. Why should individual citizens any longer pass as the atoms from which democracy has to be built? A deliberative democracy is made up, after all, of points of view from which arguments can be made. Since citizens engage in multiple discourses, it is of utmost importance to have these discourses represented, for it is by speaking in these discourses that individuals make their social appearances. A variety of discourses matters more than the individual citizens that hold them. According to Dreiser and Niemeyer, discursive legitimacy would be achieved by a deciding institution, I quote, to the extent that the collective decision is consistent with the constellation of discourses present in the public sphere. That at the end of the day, voting may be inevitable in what they envisage to be a chamber of discourses is a somewhat embarrassing fact. Dreiser and Niemeyer do not present us with a fully operationalized blueprint for transnational democracy, and it may be exceedingly difficult to arrive at one. What is conspicuous, however, is that popular sovereignty is rendered quite harmless. The folks do not vote. Global administrative bodies decide. Democratic participation is turned into the pet of bureaucratic elites. It no longer poses a threat to whoever may be pulling the levels of transnational government. The second development is congenial to the first, for it also begins with the disaggregation of the people, this time not into discourses, but into an unconnected multitude. According to the all-affected interest principle, that's the second development that I will briefly touch upon here, the people become re-aggregated from one moment to the next through action that impacts on them. The people is composed of stakeholders, that is, those whose interests are adversely affected by actions. Whoever has the resolve to design or to implement measures has to work with a flexibly extending and contracting body of stakeholders. Actions should only be taken after the affected persons have had their say on the issue. The result is that popular power becomes issue-specific, fleeting, and most importantly, a product of impact assessments. Sovereign, and I use quotation marks, so it seems, is whoever is adversely affected. Interestingly, however, the all-affected interest principle has no place for assessing the impact of impact assessments on stakeholders. In other words, Who gets to decide who the relevant stakeholders are? The all-affected interest principle does not seem to offer an answer, unless it were considered, of course, that everyone is equally affected by impact assessment-dependent allocations of political power. And thus understood, the all-affected interest principle would indeed presuppose a global demos as the ultimate seat of sovereign power. As is well known, the all-affected interest principle is beset with various difficulties. Chief among them is the policy-dependent composition of the participating demos. Not only would the demos have to be flexibly adjusted dependent on the debated or proposed impact of an action, the overall effect of a flexible demos on democracy would be nothing short of devastating. It would reinforce the individualistic illusion according to which people live their life in isolation from one another. A flexible demos is never in a position to challenge a government. How can it ever see itself as one demos? What is more, with the stable demos, the institutions of government would begun too. The result would be widespread disempowerment and disengagement from political affairs. Most conspicuously, again, the all-affected interest principle is consistent with the ethereal conception of deliberative democracy. For how else would one practically accommodate the flexible expansion and contraction of the stakeholder constituency than through processes of consultation? We shouldn't overlook that the world of this principle is also the world composed of transnational bureaucratic bodies. Democratic theories that support deliberative democracy and the all-affected interest principle are perfectly enlightened. They have overcome the dangerous illusions of nationalism. They are also high-minded. They do not turn a blind eye on how national policies spill over into foreign territory and affect those who have not had an opportunity to voice their concerns or disagreement. Some even want to oust individual choices altogether and to replace the mootness of votes with the representation of discourses. And yet, these theories are also deeply troubling. They transmute the people into an entity that is unable to act. But how can there be sovereignty without activity? I would like to argue, by way of a conclusion, that there is another way of imagining popular sovereignty. And I have to be careful here, because this is quite unfinished. I begin by characterizing the telos of popular sovereignty, because lest we forget, Hobbes' sovereignty also had a telos, had an aim, a certain use to which it has to be put. But it has to be sovereignty so that the aim can be attained. So I begin with discussing the telos and then turn to the mode of operation. And the mode of operation is markedly different from Hobbes. It's not a top-down operation of sovereignty, but a bottom-up operation of sovereignty by virtue of numbers. Now let me begin with what I imagine to be the telos of popular sovereignty. And it can be traced back to what Marx and Engels envisaged under the name of, well, it was actually Marx in the Jewish question, envisaged under the name of human emancipation. Human emancipation stands for an organized effort to rise above, from below, the shackles that we create for us by virtue of our mutual dependence. These shackles not only tie us together, they also tie us to the ground. They belittle us in a sense. They give rise to the economic interdependence that we create for ourselves, constrains our freedom through unmitigated coercion by economic circumstance. Being governed by the coercive force of economic circumstance is tantamount to being subject to an alien force. If you studied Marx, you will know what I talk about here. This just rehearses basic Marxian observations. Actually, the coercive force of economic circumstance gives rise to you and all of us having a foreign will. A force that is not you makes you want what you wouldn't want, where you invested with full freedom, that accrues from controlling, in community with others, your economic circumstance. Establishing joint controls of our lives is what sovereign power is for. That's its telos. Just like keeping the peace was the telos of its Hobbesian counterpart. Now, does this admittedly, absolutely old-fashioned, and maybe not only somewhat sophomoric idea do us any good when it comes to answering the question whether there's still something left of active popular sovereignty? I think we can see this connection if we put the telos of sovereignty, popular sovereignty, together with its mode of operation. And I sense that the key to understanding its mode of operation lies in looking at the role that numbers play within the tradition of popular sovereignty. The people have no other power than the power that accrues from being numerous. There's a longer story underlying this claim, going back to Lefort and those who follow him in his. I'm not going to go into this. But the numerosity of the people explains popular sovereignty and why it makes sense to call it sovereignty, not least because the power of the people asserts itself in a form that is as indifferent to those claiming superior insight as the insuperable power of an old-fashioned sovereign. Because if numbers count, at the end of the day, the quality of arguments has to be broken down to the number of votes that it can garner in a vote that is taken. This is why discussion is not superfluous, but at the end of the day, it is voting and the number of the people who vote for something that counts. It is important to view this translation of facticity into validity in a context where equals join forces with other equals on behalf of a project of emancipation. Only if we bear this in mind, we can distinguish between the good uses of popular sovereign power from the bad uses of sovereign power. And there is, I concede, a tension between the telos of sovereign power and how it operates. But this tension has been characteristic also for the Hobbesian concept of sovereign power. The perfect end of Hobbesian sovereign power is to secure our life and perhaps even to facilitate our happiness. But sovereign power can be used for quite different purposes too. This is also true for popular sovereignty. The assertion of one ethnic group over another is an exercise of power by the many. But it is sovereignty, if it is sovereignty, badly exercised. We cannot limit the assertion of popular sovereignty only to the good uses. However, its justification, the justification, that what makes popular sovereignty legitimate, has to be linked to rising jointly above the socially imprisoning consequences of interdependence. It is against this background that it's possible to distinguish between the good and the bad uses. And it is the good exercises that assert an interest in emancipation vis-à-vis, and now I return to Habermas, the systemic imperatives of money and power. And this is the core idea. How are we to make sense of this core idea under post-national conditions? Because bear in mind, the skeptical reservations with which this lecture began have not been challenged by anything that I've said so far. States no longer de facto rule supreme over their territory, and they may have never done so. Supranational authorities and private or informal transnational regulatory regimes have taken charge of important areas of public policy, such as education, banking, and economic crisis management. Beyond the state, there appears to be no space left for the people to rise above their interdependence. And inside of nation states, this space has become increasingly narrow and the exercise of sovereign power becomes increasingly pointless. But paradoxically, I think we can make sense of popular sovereignty by returning to a perspective on constitutions that predates the consolidation of the sovereign nation state. What if, for a change, if we again look at our constitutions as mixed constitutions, arrangements that are composed of forces that have a different origin? And I give you, by way of conclusion, just one perspective. And I'm sorry, I'm adding Hegel to all of this at the end of my lecture. From a functionalist perspective, so by asking the question, what do transnational and supranational authorities do? for us. From this functional perspective, transnational and supranational authorities and arrangements are like the administrative state that we have on a national level, exemplars of Hegel's state of necessity, Not- und Verstandesstaat. They offer systems of adjudication and sites of public authority that provide the economy with the interventions necessary to sustain it. The state of necessity invests itself with the relevant technological, economic, legal, and marketing expertise that is requisite in order to dispense its function. It's the logical extension of competitive interdependence to the task of securing its conditions. Like civil society, it is committed to the bourgeois values of creating wealth and providing inclusion, because everyone has to have a fair chance to compete. Its claim of authority rests on observing the proper constitutional legal pedigree. And yet there are moments where power is exercised that cannot be linked to the pedigree of the states of necessity, or the organs of the state of necessity. These are the moments where ordinary people disavow their allegiance to arrangements that expert bodies and cooperating governments have prepared for them. They stand up and claim that they no longer are willing to put up with what they get from them. The elites, of course, reply to their demands by saying what elites typically say to those who oppose them, namely, that the folks do not understand the issues, they fail to appreciate the complexity of the world, they behave irresponsibly and perhaps even irreverently. And yet, it is in opposition to the haughty pretensions of transnational governance that the crowd, the commoners, the ordinary folk, give us reminiscences of popular sovereignty. Resistance preserves this moment of sovereignty in which numerousness, the fact that it is many who are out in the streets, translates into authority that cannot be ignored. Acts of defiance make a new beginning. No matter what economic rationality appears to dictate, the people renounce their readiness to endure hardship. I haven't more by way of a conclusion, but to ask the question, wouldn't Habermas agree? Thank you. Was it too long? It was long, huh?
No, I bought my daughter a cookie a few days ago at Ben's Cookies at Covent Garden. It's this big, it's 2 pounds, not heavy. It costs 2 pounds. She takes the cookie, she takes a bite, and she says, wow, that was very good. So, now, floor is open. Comments, reactions, questions. Bill.
Yes, I love the critical part of your talk, and I'm still trying to understand the final part, the constructive part, so maybe you can sort some things out. One danger, if I understood you correctly, might be that you wanted, I think you wanted to conflate human emancipation and democracy, right? And I mean, I can see why you want to do that. Those things are linked, it seems to me, but one might lose something by doing that. Right? So in other words, if you're very crude about this emancipation, maybe more than self-government, right? And self-government might understand that, but you also lose some of the specificity that we have associated with certain political democracy, even social democracy. Right, so that worries me a little bit. And then, maybe this is just a follow-up. Also, the grounding of your argument. I mean, how serious you take recourse to Marx here? Because, of course, Marx's arguments about human emancipation is really writing expressed on a philosophical methodology, which many of us would consider really controversial. It's not good with the philosophical grounding for that sort of position. It's really consonant with modern democracy. Whatever we may think about Habermas and Rice, they at least are thinking about the question of how their philosophical foundations has nothing to do with democratic. So if you could tell a little bit, say a bit more about that.
Okay, very good. You want me to answer right now? Okay. First of all, I think the anthropology that we find in Marx's early work is something that resonates pretty well, I think, with the way we experience our life, yeah? That we are no longer in control of our lives, that what we engage in is basically processes of adaptation to economic circumstances that are not of our making. All that is different now that we have lost faith, that we are in a position to control it. The difference, of course, to Marxian reasoning is, and you pointed it out correctly, is that I rest my hope on some form of democratic opposition. I do not longer rest my hope on an elite party that would be the external deposit of the class consciousness that the proletariat doesn't have. So I'm not going down the Leninist road, because the Leninist road is unconvincing, unfortunately, yeah, but it is. So here is the connection. Even if Marxists have not seen the connection to democracy, I'm enough of an old-fashioned Austro-Marxist, in a sense, to rest my hope on democratic participation. But I conceded, and this may not have been clear enough in the presentation, in the limited time that I have, I conceded that it would be utopian to assume that something like full control over your economic circumstances is something that we could attain, because we simply do not have the structures that make it possible. And the disempowerment that politics has suffered in the area of globalization is so profound that it's very difficult to imagine that we could rebuild it. But if we had ever built it. But I think we read the phenomena correctly, that there is something like a desire to resist, to make a new beginning, and and what people invoke is these, what people exercise, they don't invoke, what people exercise is their power to resist whatever expertise undergirds, you know, the measures that they are exposed to. So that's the basic idea. Yeah, it's not fully finished yet. I haven't thought much about sovereignty before. This is why there's this gap. Yeah. Okay.
Gentleman in the
Right.
back, and then Neil.
Yeah.
I think that's possible to let the cake and eat it to a certain extent. You postulate that what is really defining of sovereignty is, of popular sovereignty, is a telos. But then at the end of your speech, you basically mention acts of resistance and somehow democratic opposition or disobedience as the revelatory moment of where really popular sovereignty emerges. Now, I'm not so sure you can have both, actually. Because if you have a telos, somehow you are already under a certain type of normativity, no? Which is certainly not functional, if I understand you correctly, no? Because a telos is not a function. But certainly at the same time, it's not a new beginning. I mean, if you have a telos, you cannot have a new beginning. That's my feeling. Can you have both?
Yeah, very good. I think, Marco, with all due respect, I think I disagree with you. And I think it's the secret why Hobbes' concept of sovereignty still fascinates us. And the secret is as follows. Hobbesian sovereignty has a telos, peace. We want peace, and we want a little bit our share of happiness in our life. But the means thereto has to be that we concede sovereign power to someone. And we have to trust. And this is in a sense, it's a bet that we make, or a risk that we take. We have to take our chances. There's no other way for attaining this objective than taking our chances that the sovereign will actually bring peace. In a similar manner, I think, popular sovereignty also is the type of sovereignty where we have a telos, an interest in emancipation. And I don't claim that this is the concept of popular sovereignty that is timeless. I think the concept of popular sovereignty that I tried to develop here is very much linked to the experience of our time. It's a way of reconceiving of it under our circumstances. But it is linked to this telos of emancipation. And also, at the end of the day, we have no one else to rest our hope on than the people resisting those who keep explaining to the people that what is done to them and all the suffering that they have to endure is in their best long-term interest. The only ones who will do it and will exercise this resistance and try to push the agenda of emancipation will be the people. So this is why I see this close link to the original concept of sovereignty, even though the emphasis is a completely different one. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Neil?
So, again, great talk. Again, some issues at the end. I mean, I was thinking, maybe along similar lines to Marco. When we were talking towards the end, for some reason, I was reminded of someone who probably wouldn't want your talk to be reminded of, which was Rainer Frost. And his idea of the right to justification. Yeah. So, power situations in modernity, in the ways in which we react to economic, political, cultural power, is it always starts off, the illicit power is always there first. And politics, you know, unlike a lot of our mythologies of politics, where politics comes first, politics is always calling someone to account, asking, is the right of justification? It always starts in very, very different, a very, very wide range of contexts. But there's something about the morphology of that which means that once you get involved in it, you know, the right to justification starts a process of toing and froing and coming and going, which always ends up at a point beyond some open-ended notion of emancipation. It's always a justification of a particular act, a particular set of practices. It's always perhaps a transformation of that particular set of practices. It's always a new iteration of justification as you amend that particular set of practices. So there's a sense in which maybe you can't have your cake and eat it, because there's an aspect of this which is you know, if you think of it in terms of the right of justification, and what you're describing is just the latest iteration of the power game. And that power game will unfold in precisely the same way as every early iteration of that, for better or for worse.
It is not that I disagree with you, Neil, but the problem that I have with Reiner's right to justification is, and I don't want to quote Wittgenstein because I'm not so much of a Wittgenstein fan, but all justifications come to an end, right? And at this end, someone has to decide whether the justification was convincing or not. And unfortunately, our friend Reiner never takes this into account. There's always the justification. And I think the beautiful discourses that he would develop, they can be perfectly co-opted. Look at the websites of the European Union, look at the website of other institutions. They confront us with discourse all the time. So they are perfectly capable of communicating to us and giving us justifications. But the essential point, I think, of democratic authority, and it is democratic authority that I talk about here, of course, is that when all has been said and done, and when there is no good reason to believe that we have to concede a certain independent epistemic authority to a certain body because you have to have certain training to understand things well. When we really come down to the political issues of where you suffer losses, issues like distribution and the redistribution of wealth. Yeah? In a democracy, nobody can claim superior judgment to anyone else. That everyone is equally the judge of whether the right to justification has been successfully cashed out in a certain situation. And therefore, numbers count at the end of the day. Majorities count at the end of the day. Democracy, popular sovereignty is about counting. Yeah?
Couldn't I just soften all that by saying, actually, it's not about the final justification, it's always about the latest justification.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I don't want to claim that this is final authority and this is then unalterable. Yeah, there are a number of justifications, cycles of justification that we can go through. Yeah, right. No.
We have three more so far. So
okay.
Claire, and then you, and then Nico.
Claire.
Thank you very much. That was a really, really interesting, I think, and challenging talk in many ways. I think my concern follows well on Neil's. And I appreciate your analysis of the dilution of popular sovereignty and the sort of takeover or the replacement of the technocratic stakeholders and whatnot as the source of a legitimation of private transnational authority today. And this is something that troubles me deeply. So I would love to see popular sovereignty put back into that equation. But I think about, for example, the financial crisis, the result of it, and the worst economic crisis we've had since the Depression. And somehow or other, these groups of private bankers and financiers were able to convince the populations that bailout is common sense. And to the point where most of us now live in states where we have legislation that if you have over a certain amount of deposits in your bank, they're up for grabs if the bank has problems. And yet, at the same time, we have not seen the kind of prudential regulation match that, that I think ability to dip into the popular domain and bail out these financiers. And so I'm not so sure I have faith in the recovery of popular sovereignty. And I'm trying to pinpoint the ability, when did the idea that publics should bail out transnational banks that declare scandalous profits regularly, when did that become common sense?
Okay.
Or
He's answering you through a book. She's almost done, though.
You're waiting for me. That's very kind of you. Thank you. Yeah.
Would you like me
Yeah,
to
please go
ask
ahead.
the question already, or? Hi.
No, it's
Thank
fine.
you very much for a very interesting talk. I was thinking that Habermas's thought offers some solutions as well as some problems with it, especially if all you do is to read Habermas all the time, like I do. I was thinking that Habermas's understanding of popular sovereignty is closely linked with one particular nation and one particular nation state. In the third chapter of the Beaten-Facts and Norms, he's equating the notion of popular sovereignty with rights. But about 15 years later than that, he turns to the notion of the realistic utopia of human rights and dignity. He publishes that in the journal called Metaphilosophy originally, and then interprets that one more time for one of his last recent monographs on Europe. So the notion of human rights and dignity earn even more importance for Habermas's thought, closer to the crisis of the European Union that we are living through until today. But when we go back to his political theory, his magnum opus, that's the Beaten-Facts and Norms, we see that the notion of popular sovereignty is closely linked with rights, and it's not exactly human rights, it's just rights. And then rights is linked with private and public autonomy, which is a little bit difficult to get out of as well. I was thinking whether you had anything to offer about these dilemmas that we have with Habermas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to take one more? Is that
Yeah,
it?
let's take a while.
Okay, Nico.
What was it again?
I don't know. That's why I said
Nico?
Oh, yeah, you can have this.
Yeah, I think it's faster. All right. Thanks. Now it also got there. Yeah, true. It's unjustified amplification. Great, Sasha. I really love the direction you're taking with this and your critical take. Even though you sometimes identify me with the global administrative folks, and
No, it was.
so we haven't named me.
It was a
at least, so
variation on your team of liquid sovereignty.
I'm happy that you're moving. You seem to be moving away from your constituent power interpassive conventionality take that you did a few years ago, and you're going into a sort of clearer sort of popular sovereignty-driven direction. I'm very happy about that. But I wanted to ask you, sort of, who are the people that you're talking about with your uprisings? So somehow, the way you depicted the people seemed a bit somewhat nostalgic, and maybe in a way that that Negri sort of gives an idyllic picture of the multitude and how everybody rises up. And this sort of, if one really looks at sort of who rises up and who is able to mobilize, we don't see the numbers that you said. So democracy is somewhat about counting numbers and figuring out who wants more. But this is not something that we see in the kind of pockets of resistance again that we maybe in Seattle. People resist the international, so WTO, and they rise up against the international financial institutions here and there. But but counting them doesn't make any sense, really, because there's always small numbers of people that kind of rise up. So are these the people, and can we say, can they have more of a claim to being the people than the elites? Because in fact what they do is only make another claim at representation of a people that is again completely absent. And the link between these is something that I think still needs to be constructed.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Thank you. This is actually very helpful. Now I have to give replies. Yeah. Okay. Very good. I did two things in my paper, and I should not have done this so quickly, and maybe I should have thought more about what I do in my paper. Yeah. I take the notion of popular sovereignty with its telos and its mode of operation, but I then transplant it into a pre-modern political context, in a sense, yeah, where the power of the people is a force that is counteracting other forces. Because I believe that the Machiavellian idea of a mixed constitution is much more accurate to the situation that we're currently in than old-fashioned constitutionalist vocabulary, yeah? And you may therefore be disappointed, rightly so, disappointed, that you don't see the locus of popular sovereignty other than in these pockets of resistance that are now deliberately called liquid sovereignty that becomes solidified in certain moments, yeah? And let me add French political language to it. In certain events, it just happens from time to time, yeah, that we see it. And it will be, interestingly, self-authenticating. It will be self-authenticating in a certain way. I'll get back to this a little bit later. So you see a huge gap that I've left with my presentation, and I know that. Now, Habermas. I stopped reading Habermas at the point where it became too disappointing. Yeah? So to be honest, after the post-national constellation and the constitutionalization of public international law, I thought. So I stopped at the one book that I'm truly familiar with is Between Facts and Norms, Faktizität und Geltung, and it is there where we have this appendix, popular sovereignty as a procedure. Yeah? But now that you're telling me that Habermas I've read his pieces on dignity, and they are good, yeah? That his thought has moved more towards human rights and dignity. What then becomes of popular sovereignty? Well, the one thing that has become of popular sovereignty in the context of the German constitution, an act of recognition. An act of recognition in which you express your reverence and your respect of certain fundamental moral values. That's then it, yeah? Hauke Brunkhorst still retains the image of this free-floating, potentially anarchical popular sovereignty. So that's still in place. I cannot give you a more satisfactory answer. Now, who are the people? Sovereignty is dangerous as a concept because everyone can claim, yeah, to be the people. There are the folks chanting, wir sind das Volk, while a home for asylum seekers goes up in flames. This has happened in Germany just recently. Well, that's sovereignty badly exercised, yeah, I would say. But indeed, two clues. If I'm right, that the people, that the point of sovereignty, the telos of sovereignty is to overcome interdependence. Those will exercise this power who are hit hardest by the existing economic interdependence. So there is a reason why we associate the power of the people with the power of ordinary people who have no other means available to make their interests felt than by standing up and being many and being there. Now, you're correct when it comes to masses that are marching in the street. It is no longer about counting votes, but it is about, at a symbolic level, about being numerous, about being many, about being the many out there in the street. And there will always be, this is unavoidable, an element of self-identification of those who identify sovereign power. I no longer believe that the sovereign power is then exercised on behalf of a noumenon, yeah? The people as a mystical entity. No, it is more specific. It is about an interest of emancipation that is articulated by those whom we call the many. That, I think, is the idea. Yeah.
Good. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.